Samantha Power, Administrator for U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Welcome to our screen.
Good to be back.
I would like to start by talking about the situation in Gaza and the latest development. 95%, we all know, of the population has not had access to clean water for months. More than 1 million people face catastrophe levels of hunger. More than 36,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and these are conservative figures, since the start of the war. 2/3 of them are women and children. So I would like to start by asking you about something that gave us hope this morning in New York here, which is an amended U.S. draft enshrining the plan that at the end of last week announced by President Biden from the White House. The president said, and I'm quoting him here, that the militant group, meaning Hamas, was no longer capable of launching an attack on Israel like the October 7th attack that triggered the war, and that it was time for the fighting to end. I'm sure you had a look at the latest revision of the U.S. draft, and which is, I understand, is under silent procedure till early this evening, about 5:30 this evening, New York time, and it includes 3 phases. How hopeful are you? What are your expectations for this draft to succeed and pass the vote later in the Security Council and put an end to this nightmare of a conflict?
Well, nightmare is the word, and a nightmare, of course, for the families of people whose hostages, whose loved ones are still hostages. Nightmare for the people in Gaza whose conditions you've just described very ably, which align entirely with what we see in terms of the humanitarian partners that we fund. One of our partners actually, since the Rafah invasion occurred, has reported a 500% increase in blast injuries. Just again, a tent for those people who've been displaced from Rafah, the price has gone from about $50 to about $800. So desperate are people for shelter. So the statistic you used, what I'm describing, what we all know to be happening, and above all, what the Gazans are suffering, just injects such a degree of urgency, an emergency sense of urgency around securing this ceasefire proposal. And you mentioned the 3 phases, and of course, those are enshrined in the Security Council resolution, which we want the world to rally around. We think it'll be very powerful as a Security Council, which has been pretty divided on a lot of issues over a lot of years, if they could speak with one voice on this proposal that is on the table, but has not yet been accepted by Hamas. First phase, ceasefire and Israeli forces pulling out of populated areas. What that would mean for me and USAID and our humanitarian partners is flooding the zone with humanitarian assistance and mobility for aid workers and for civilians to be able to access that food. Second phase, moving toward a permanent cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza altogether. That would be a major difference, of course, in terms of the conditions for people on the ground. And then the third phase, reconstruction. Now, in the first phase, some hostages released. Second phase, the remainder of the living hostages released. This is so important. And then in the third phase, along with reconstruction, making sure that any hostage that has been killed in custody gets returned to their loved ones. So what is not to support in this proposal? We need Hamas to come to the table. Egypt has endorsed this proposal. The Qataris have endorsed this proposal, and we hope the whole world will be endorsing it later today.
Phase 3 of the plan announced by the president and the resolution actually mention it, includes a major reconstruction plan for Gaza that would commence in phase 3. Would USAID take part in the reconstruction efforts of Gaza?
Well, I think, we, of course, as the number one, best resourced humanitarian and development agency in the world, we would wish to do everything in our power to support reconstruction. I know for the families of those living in Gaza, that day feels really far off right now. And so our entire focus, in all honesty, is how do we get food to people who are facing famine-like conditions. How do we get more tents, to families that are living out effectively in the wilderness, unable to shelter their families, and with so few hospitals or even medical facilities working, how do we have sort of pop-up clinics that can tend to some of the injuries that the kinetic and ongoing conflict is causing. So that's our focus now, but at the same time, we as a government are already looking ahead and to see how we would mobilize the resources that we know are going to be needed. We would look to our partners in the Gulf, our European friends and others. When we get to that point, I know that they're the same kind of solidarity that we've seen expressed, toward on the basis of the humanitarian conditions and suffering going on right now. We would hope that would carry over and that people would be willing to open up their hearts and their checkbooks to invest in that reconstruction.
USAID spent $320 million on setting up maritime corridor that involves about 1,000 U.S. service members, mainly from the Army and the Navy. And it's complex, multi-step process through which aid is moved to humanitarian organizations ready to facilitate distribution to Palestinian communities throughout Gaza. How long do you foresee the pier will stay in service? We understand it's not in service now, it's being repaired. Hopefully it will come back soon. But how long do you foresee that this pier will be used?
Well, let me first just say that land crossings are everything. They are the foundation for making sure that humanitarian and commercial traffic reach the people of Gaza. It's incredibly important that the Defense Department, which funded this pier, actually not USAID, we fund the supplies that many of the supplies that go through the pier to reach people. But they took this on because we know that the conditions are so dire that every single point of entry that we can mobilize, that we can generate, is going to matter. It's going to matter for someone. And that pier, when it's at full scale, will feed as many as 500,000 people for a month. That's incredibly important, but it's no substitute for sustained land access and mobility, safe mobility for humanitarian workers who operate by road and using these large kind of truck convoys that we've seen operate in so many other theaters of war around the world. I think right now it's not clear how long that the corridor will be operative. A lot has been invested on the front end, so we would like this to be a point of entry for a long time in the future. But if everything else is working, there are cheaper ways to get food and commercial goods in the people of Gaza. So right now we're in a both and mindset, but if we were to get that ceasefire, see all the points of land entry open, that we already have proof of concept that they can be open. So if they're all open at once and we can get the number of trucks and the drivers operating safely, we can get an awful lot done by land to redress the deficits that have been created by having too little getting in for too long, but also the deficits created by the destruction of arable land, by supermarkets, of people's homes and everything that was in those homes, including food stocks. So we have our work cut out for us catching up and making up for lost time.
Well, when do you expect the pier to come back to service?
I'm not going to get ahead of the Defense Department on that. I know they're working 24/7 to bring it back online. But again, I want to underscore the importance in the meantime of all these other points of access being opened and the Israeli government moving aggressively to ensure many points are open at once.
2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza are experiencing acute levels of food insecurity. 1.1 million of them at a catastrophic levels. You yourself said North Gaza is in famine, a man-made famine. The ICJ is looking into charges of genocide against Israel based on the use of starvation as a weapon of war. Can you see how confusing is this to the Palestinian people? On one hand, USAID is doing what it can do to alleviate the suffering in Gaza, and on the other hand, the US supplies of weapons to Israel and funds that are widely used in Gaza now inflict civilians further pain and suffering, like the US-made bombs Israel used in the strike on the encampment in Rafah and killed several people, a number of people, a great number actually, while they were asleep on Sunday, the 26th of May. Can you see the predicament of the Palestinians? They don't know, are we dealing with a friend or a foe?
Well, I think, Talal, that President Biden has made the judgment from the beginning that he was going to use his good offices and U.S. leverage and years of having such an important partnership with the State of Israel to push for civilian protection, a different approach to pursuing Hamas, which everyone knows has to be done, given that Hamas still has as its stated objective killing Jews and destroying Israel. But using his leverage in just the way he is seeking to do right now, which is to secure a ceasefire and then move to efforts to secure a permanent cessation of hostilities and an end to this war. So, my focus at USAID is on the humanitarian side and on addressing the effects. I absolutely think that it is legitimate to ask questions about the root causes. The root causes are this conflict, and we need to move in phases that bring about the release of hostages, bring about a much greater surge of supplies to people in need, but also recognize that a lot of the suffering is not just because of the shortage of trucks that are coming in and out, but because of IDF military operations. And those simply have to be conducted in a manner in which fewer civilians are being killed. And that is something that President Biden, again, is conveying in every single one of his engagements with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the rest of us are doing with the rest of the Israeli cabinet.
Have USAID solved the Israelis, with the Israelis, the questions concerning aid group safety while operating in Gaza, allowing them to distribute food, water, medicines to the people of Gaza in safety and security?
I think it would be very premature to say that issue has been solved. I will say, in a war environment, it is something that is always challenging. But when you see more than 200 aid workers having been killed, most of them Palestinian, most of them Gazan, obviously the system is not working as it should. And there have been improvements, particularly since the killing of the World Central Kitchen workers, most of whom were not Palestinian, not Gazan, all but one were from outside of Gaza. But nonetheless, that kickstarted belatedly a more energized effort to create a different kind of deconfliction system. So progress has been made since then, but much more needs to be done. It absolutely needs to be the case that every humanitarian who is risking their life to feed their fellow humans, their neighbors, and people who don't themselves have the fuel or potentially even the stamina to be able to move to go and get food, those aid workers need to be empowered, but they also need to be protected. And so that's something, again, that President Biden is raising in all of his engagements with the government of Israel, and USAID is on the ground following up to try to make sure the modalities are improved as well.
Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Relief, said this week that the UN is not leaving Gaza unless security is so bad that it's just too dangerous to be there, and delivering is something that has been made almost impossible. How essential for the humanitarian work that United Nations, spearheaded by UNRWA, remains in Palestine and do what it can do always best? How essential is UNRWA in this operation of delivering the humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people?
Well, I would just quote President Biden on the conditions, which is a reprise of what we've been discussing. President Biden said, last week that the Palestinian people in Gaza are in sheer hell, that they're in a living hell. And when people are facing those kinds of circumstances, it is absolutely imperative that all the tools that can be brought to bear to ameliorate that suffering and to address what in some cases, as you said, are catastrophic conditions of hunger, everything be brought to bear. And so any disruption, whether that's the closure of a checkpoint or whether that is an organization deciding that it has to suspend its operations, which of course World Central Kitchen had to do in the wake of the killing of its workers. And we have seen periodically, different organizations on the ground who work everywhere in the world having temporarily to suspend their operations, but by and large bringing them back online because they are so determined to reach people in need. So we need all of the players who are active in Gaza to remain active. We need their aid workers who are international to be able to be rotated in and out as well. So there's a constant infusion of energy because the work is so difficult. And those are individuals who give great support and solidarity and resources to their Palestinian colleagues on the ground. So this entire effort, we need to make sure that it can be sustained and indeed that it can be expanded.
Administrator Power, time is catching up with us. We have time for one more last question, and I would actually would like to move to Sudan. Mr. Martin Griffiths said this week it is highly likely that there will be up to 5 million Sudanese people at risk of famine when the next IPC report is published in coming weeks. What is USAID doing to help the Sudanese people in these dire times?
Well, first, let me thank you for asking the question, because I think that there is absolutely appropriate focus on Gaza and the suffering there, given the number of civilians and again that have been displaced, who are dependent on humanitarian assistance. But it really does bear drawing more attention as well, alongside that in Gaza, to the suffering of the Sudanese people, because more than half of the population there are in some need of assistance. And roughly 18 million people are in need of food assistance. They have no other way to feed their families. So in terms of scale, the needs are just overwhelming. You asked what the United States is doing, what USAID is doing. We are the people who, provide the food, the medicine, the shelter. So many people have been displaced already in this conflict. Some, you could say the lucky ones, have made it to neighboring countries, but a lot of people are displaced. Millions of people are displaced inside Sudan and subjected to terror. Anytime a militia or potentially an army unit arrives, there's the risk of significant harms inflicted on civilians. This is just becoming a weapon of war. Food is being used as a weapon of war. Food is not being allowed to move from point A to point B, depending if it has to cross, the Rapid Support Forces territory or the Sudanese Armed Forces territory. Both parties could be doing much, much more. I would call this, what we say in the aid world, is a break glass moment. This is a moment in which both of the belligerent parties in the war need to be doing everything in their power to allow humanitarians to do their work, to take the $100 million that we announced just in April, to provide more food and more assistance, and make sure that those supplies aren't sitting in a port somewhere, but that they are reaching people who have been displaced and who, again, are in mortal fear. I will say just one last thing, if I could, because yes, we will deal with the humanitarian symptoms, but what has to happen is this war has to end. And the parties, the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces, or at least the warring parties, have to come together and be part of a negotiation, first for a ceasefire and then for a lasting end of hostilities. That diplomacy is underway. Our colleague, Mr. Lamamra, is the UN Special Representative. We, the United States, have appointed a special envoy, Tom Perriello, who's working hand in glove with the United Nations. But Arab nations, African nations, any country with influence over the SAF or the RSF needs to bring this fighting to an end, because only then will we avert that famine.
Samantha Power, Administrator of U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, we thank you for this interview and your insights, and for all the good work and effort on behalf of the Palestinians and other people in desperate situations around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Talal.
Thank you.